Hello and welcome. My name is Steven Sorensen. I'm the creator of Ctruth, and this is Scholarly Snippets Season 2, Episode 6. Scholarly Snippets is my show where I interview people with history degrees or related degrees in order to shed light on the world of history and historical scholarship. Today I'm joined by Dr. Ken Mondschein. To give some background on his degrees, in 1997 he received a Bachelor of Arts with a double major in History and Classics, minoring in Art History. A year later, in 1998, he received a Master of Arts in History. Then, in 2010, he received a PhD in History with his thesis being on duration, timekeeping, university, and society in late medieval Paris. Ken is the author of numerous books. His most recent was published last year in Baltimore by Johns Hopkins University Press under the title On Time, A History of Western Timekeeping. As you watch, think of questions that you would have asked that I didn't ask, and then comment them below so I can get a better view of what you want to hear from my guests. Without further ado, here's the interview. Ken, thanks for joining me today. I appreciate you taking some time out of your schedule to participate here. How are you doing?
Doing okay, as well as anybody's doing in these uncertain times.
That's good to hear. So this is my show, Scholarly Snippets. I'm interviewing people with history degrees or related degrees about their experiences in the field of history or whatever related field that they're in. Right off the bat, I want to know, what is history to you? How do you define history?
History is the entirety of human experience. I take a very broad and expansive view of what history is, because in a sense, everything is history, because everything, even science and technology, are standing at the tail end of historical development. And of course, it gives us guidance for going forwards. There's a fallacy. There's the end of history fallacy that we're going to change less in the future than we have changed in the past. We kind of like to think about stability, right? That things are going to be stable. But if history teaches us anything, it's that everything is unstable. Everything stands at the end of historical development. So really, if we talk about what history is a subtotal of human experience, including reasons why, philosophy, everything.
So history is everything?
History is everything. Nothing human should be strange to the historian.
Right.
And really all fields, statistics, mathematics, psychology, have been applied to history in one way or another. So if you think about it, everything that we do is history, because everything is based off of past experience. I asked my undergraduates when I was teaching. I was asked my undergraduates, "Who's a historian here?" And none of them would raise their hands. I said, "Well, who's ever been pulled over by the police?" And some of them would raise their hands. I said, "Are you? Were you more careful driving past the place where you got pulled over?" And they say, "Yes, we were." I said, "So, are you being a historian?" And they said, "Well, I guess so." And I said, "Well, every time I open the cabinet where the cat food's kept, the cats come running and they think it's time to be fed. Are my cats historians?" And they're like, "Well, no." I said, "So what is history?" Well, history is something that is impersonal. It's the broadest possible interpretation, the broadest possible scope of what's going on. So if we're talking about being human experience, it's when we take the experience of the past, but we depersonalize it, and we usually using, primary documents and things like that, though not necessarily really, because we really do need to expand what is history and what are primary sources and what is the goal of history beyond merely the written record to write the broadest possible histories. But when we talk about what it is the broadest possible human experience, into which we can bring even fields like mathematical fields like statistics. We can bring in social science fields, sociology, and I think that history is greatly strengthened when we do bring in things like sociology, psychology, and other fields. So it's not just the study of the past, but it's also, in many senses, the study of ourselves, because we're always thinking with history. History is, in many ways, and this kind of gets into your historiography question, history is only valuable so much as these pasts are useful to us and things that we can think with. The biggest example of that being the current controversy over Civil War monuments, Confederate monuments in the American South. You go to Lexington, Virginia, for instance, and there's positively shrines to Robert E. Lee, not to mention an entire university, at least in part, named after him, right? And these were, in turn, a way of using the past and thinking about and with the past at the turn of the 20th century, when Confederate veterans were starting to die off, and people started thinking about the past in a way that memorialized the Civil War. And today, of course, we're questioning this. If we look at the law, right? We look at why do so many undergraduate history majors wind up going to law school? Well, the law is essentially the study of history, precedences, but also what was the meaning of this when the law in question was written, right? What was intended. That, in a sense, you really can't do law without doing history. So history has very broad applications to all fields of human endeavor. And if we look at science and technology, really any science, any technology that we have stands at the end of a historical development, and it came about for reasons. So really, if we look at the history of science and technology, then really it has the really, really broad encompassing views.
I think it's in one of your books the book On Time, you mentioned something along the lines of timekeeping being the basis of science. It's fundamentally necessary.
Yeah, timekeeping is the basis of science, that the independent variable is time, is change over time. In a sense.
So in a single sentence, how would you define history?
Oh, geez.
We got to crush it down to one sentence.
We have to crush it down to one sentence. Knowing ourselves.
History is knowing ourselves. And as you were talking, I thought of another question. What makes a historian, in your opinion? Where is the line between a layman and a historian?
That's a really good question, because that line has become imperceptibly thin as the idea of authority has become eroded, and that people can, one risks committing the no true Scotsman fallacy by saying, well, a historian is someone who considers all the sources or doesn't like cherry pick the sources. But of course, all history is, in a sense, making a case. So it becomes almost imperceptibly thin when we start getting to things like, say, again, interpretations of, well, the meaning of the Civil War. What was the Civil War about? We can look at the documentary history and say, well, yes, this was about slavery, but you can always cherry pick your sources and look otherwise. And so what I would say is, what a historian is someone who's accepted by the community as a historian. That is, because to say someone's a historian, that imparts a bit of authority, does it not? So what somebody who has authority, well, someone who has authority who is given that authority by their community. So again, history is inherently political.
So in your opinion, community makes a historian?
Community, right? Community of historians, but also someone who's acknowledged as a historian by the community. That, if you go to the Children of Confederate Veterans organization, their house historians, the people they call historians, are going to be very, very different from the people the University of Chicago acknowledges as historians, right? Or the AHA, right? You can call Jim Grossman the AHA, right? And say, like, hey, you know, who's a historian? And I don't think he would really count the whomever's, you know, the daughters of Confederate veterans working for them, right? And giving a sort of you know, a lost cause memorial version of history as being historians. But certainly to that community, right? To that community, those people are historians. And now, as we're getting into a post-truth world, when I would argue that the study of history, at least in what used to be called the scientific sense back in the 19th century, but the study of objective history, thorough, systematic, and scholarly study of history, well, that that's arguably more important than ever. But at the same time, it's almost becoming irrelevant because people are picking and choosing their own truth. So in a sense, I'm very pessimistic and I'm very, very nihilistic about it, right? That there's something inherently positivist about the idea of quote unquote scientific history, that there are certain truths and that these are discoverable and that we can know them. But I'm kind of saying that no, maybe, you know, that because of the are living in a post-truth world, and it's not just on the right but also on the left, in many ways that has, you know, that has gone to hell, right? That has it's obfuscated. So it's a very, very difficult question if you think about it, right? When we think about that, because we can look for so many, there's so many exceptions and there's so many, you know, and there's so much insanity going on. And if you haven't noticed, like, I am very much a pessimist and a nihilist because I look at the academy and, you know, people are making the case, well, history is important. It's important that we, you know, in the terms of professionalization. And if you look at what houses, you know, one thing that says society values a thing is that it's supported financially, and that in the academy, right, in the academy proper, support for history is decreasing in the K through 12 classroom, right? Social study has been replaced by reading and math. History is no longer seen as really important. It's just stuff that happened a long time ago. It's not forward thinking. It's not the future. It's not important. So we're not supporting historians. And that has led to two things. One, it's led to the sort of closing of ranks and the sort of monoculture of thinking in the academy, right? That there's a sort of orthodoxy, right? There's a sort of Catholicism in the academy, that there's not really a diversity of thought. And there's as in groups and out groups become more important and more defined because of the importance of access to resources, then divergent opinions become less tolerated. And that's within the academy, that there is a narrowing within the academy, I think, without doubt. And then if we look outside the, you know, look elsewhere, well, there's also that there's less outreach, there's less education in history. And so this sort of fallen torch of who gets to say what's history and what happened and what it means gets picked up by really anyone who wants to. And we see this, you know, very, 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 you know, often. We see on, you know, on YouTube, there's all these crazy people, like, well, they shouldn't have people who weren't Nordic portraying Vikings in TV shows. Never mind that, you know, the Norse went all over, you know, they went down to Baghdad, they went to Byzantium, right? If you look at the real history, it's, you know, like, oh no, you know, they want this diversity in our portrayal of Vikings but if you look at, you know, the actual Norse, they were, you know, they're going to bloody North America, right? And meeting, you know, indigenous Native Americans, and they were going to Greenland. Sorry. They were going to Greenland, and they were, you know, meeting Inuit, and they were trading and fighting with the Inuit, right? The actual history, you know, the one thing you don't see portrayed on TV shows is the Viking Inuit wars, right? It's like too crazy. No one would believe it. So yeah, it's if you look at the actual history, it is way, 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 way crazier than anyone would think. It's like stuff that no one would do. They're complaining, and people complain because Heimdall in the Thor movies is black. I mean, that's great. It's he should have been Inuit. So.
I see what you're saying. I'm for representation in movies, and we can acknowledge that there are some liberties taken as to how the people are presented. But I'm curious, how would you define pseudo-history, if you even think that's a thing?
I mean, pseudo-history, I suppose, would be that which, instead of going from evidence to conclusions, argues the other way. Inductively from conclusions to find sources for it. It's that which begins with a bias, and it can be biases on both the right and the left. I'm not holding anybody not accountable for this. Just because I may agree with their political position doesn't mean that I think they're doing history terrifically, right? And very often driven by the political needs, right? That which is going to get funding, right? Because money corrupts everything. Pseudo history is that if we don't look at our own cognitive biases, right? Everyone would do well, I think, to bear in mind cognitive, what cognitive biases are and what we're looking for, and that looking at Bayesian logic and just doubting ourselves and really, looking at the sources and what does the sources tell us and how can we argue different things. At the same time, the problem is that we're inherently a narrative species. We like stories, we like narratives. And if you're going to do, no one likes just statistics, right? Statistics are probably the closest you can approach to truth in history. If you have numbers, right? If I add up the number of chairs and tables in wills from 14th century Venice, then I can have like a good idea of what interior furnishings were like in 14th century Venice. But no one's going to read that because that's boring. People like stories. People want the story about someone's heirs arguing over their possessions, because that's the problem. You have to draw a good balance between truth and truthiness, right? Between verifiable fact, hopefully, statistically, numerically justified, if at all possible, and telling a story that's going to appeal to people, because no one approves a grant application on the basis of numbers. They do it because it tells a compelling story. So
pseudo history is inductive. It works from an assumption and tries to make the pieces fit the picture, basically.
Yeah, I would say that, but I'd say there's other things as well, right? That it's, I mean, you start shitting into the Fortean people with Atlantis and aliens building the pyramids.
Yeah, and everyone like from Lemuria from the Lost Continent.
Yeah, or so proper history relies on proper sources that are attested, verifiable sources from the period. It relies on hard evidence, physical evidence, and it seeks to approach those in a methodical way.
Yeah, let's talk about method. How do you define historical method?
I think historical method has probably had several enormous changes in recent decades, especially as, well, a number of things. When a lot of cultures either didn't have writing, think the Aboriginal peoples of Australia didn't have writing, though they did have oral history, right? Or think the griots of West Africa, or their history was destroyed. Think the Spanish destroying Maya and Aztec codices, or they simply just Westerners were not interested in it. Think of the vast numbers of manuscripts from Timbuktu, now sadly kind of scattered and hard to get to, but we have all these manuscripts and we have all these sources there, but they're just not studied because it wasn't in anyone's interest to say, yeah, these peoples of West Africa had a long history in literacy, right? It's easier to say this was a history-free zone before Europeans arrived there and they came into history. So so to proper methodology, we really do need to expand into things like genetics. Fascinating stuff being done on migration era Europe, sometimes called Dark Age Europe, in terms of genome sequencing from graves, from bodies found in graves, sequencing the isotopes found in people's teeth, the teeth of bodies, and things like that. So, simply saying it's paper is, it's a very 19th century way of thinking about things. It's really considering all of the evidence, and then of course synthesizing all of that. So vast periods we don't have a lot of evidence, but if you look at DNA drift, you look at teeth, you find that people were traveling long distances in this period. You look at coinage finds, you can reconstruct trade routes, and so there's a lot of these silent sources that we can use, and these are some of the most fascinating sources, right? The DNA, the tooth isotopes, all of that.
Well, it sounds like you're mentioning a lot of the newer forensic sciences and their application to history.
Absolutely, and these are just so exciting. They're so fun and so fascinating, and they say such interesting things that completely, in some cases, upend what people thought before. And of course, we have the old-fashioned written sources, which are just, stuff people just happen to write down, which can be even more fun because people always wrote stuff with a reason. And that, in some cases, the reason what they're writing is more interesting, right? The historiography is more interesting and more fun than what they're actually saying. What they're actually saying may actually be unverifiable. But certainly the way in which they present it is interesting.
So what do you think historiography is? How do you define that?
Historiography is the study of history. But where it gets really, really fun is when you're studying past historians, right? Read Edward Gibbon. Well, what Edward Gibbon wrote about the Roman Empire says more about Edward Gibbon in some cases than it says about the Roman Empire. What caused the fall of Rome? Christianity. What do we think today causes the fall of Rome? Climate change. People argue stuff for reasons.
And Gibbon, he was taken in by Chatterton, wasn't he? The forger child, the teenage forger. He included a forged poem in the intro to his Fall of Rome or History of Rome. I think that's right.
Yeah, there are a lot of
historical forgers are interesting too when we're talking about writing history and the reasons that people have for writing it.
Oh, like the donation of Constantine, right? So,
that one's really controversial too. There's, I think, arguments out there that it wasn't a forgery. It was then later turned into one, but I don't know. We don't need to pick the bones there today.
That's, but is considered to be a forgery, beginning in the 15th century. And discovering this was really, really interesting because they thought I think it was Carolingian. What else was there, right?
Historiography is the study of history. It's very meta.
Yeah, it's meta history, and that's a great book by Hayden Way, is Meta History, right? It's the meta history, which is even more interesting than the history itself in some cases.
Let's get back to some roots. What originally got you interested in history? You got your bachelor's degree in 97, so it's been quite a while.
Don't tell people how old I am.
What was your original muse, your original inspiration for studying history?
Autism. I don't know, it was like knights and castles and sword stuff. So, and little bit neurodiversity going on there in the old head. And I kind of parlayed that into a large, kind of cut my way back into being able to pass for neuronormal. I don't even know what the word for that is. Not neurodiverse. Um, neuronormative, whatever.
Neurotypical, I think.
Neurotypical. Yeah. So I managed to crawl my way into being able to pretend to be neurotypical through history and through studying these things, and everything is knights and castles and stuff like that. But I gotta say, 1980s swords and sorcery movies were definitely a big impact.
Are you still on the hunt for the six-fingered man?
No, I killed him a while ago. It's the afterwards.
Good to hear.
I got that off the bucket list.
What came first, the fencing or the history?
Well, I didn't get to fence till college, do sword fighting to college. I grew up in a very unfashionable part of Brooklyn, New York, and I was always weird and I never fit in. But I always wanted to do it, right? So I got to college and I found the SCA. God help me. And I was like, oh my God! It was like, if you remember the what is it, No Rain video by Blind Melon from the 90s. You can Google it. That's a bit of history itself. I felt like the bee girl who had found the bee people. And so there was that. And then I quickly realized, well, wait a minute, this is a little nutty. This is maybe not where I want to be. And that, and being sort of an overachieving nutbag, brought me sort of full circle. I really decided I want to get my doctorate. I said, well, what can I do with my life, with my time on Earth? And I've been thinking about mortality and a lot of stuff lately. I have a friend, a couple of older people I know are injured or ill or have some serious life-changing circumstances. So there's that comes to mind, but also this 20th anniversary of 9/11 is coming up, and I was working there in an office doing social studies textbooks, and I watched 9/11 happen across the island. People in an office just like mine were burning and dying and throwing themselves out of windows. I couldn't see that from where I was. I was, in Midtown. But I'm watching the towers burn and collapse, and I'm like, I had my master's, but it was a terminal master's, let's say. And so I'm watching this happen, and I'm like, okay, I only got one life to live, and I really want that PhD. Let me do something that's like meaningful to me, right? Where I've got something, I'm going to leave something that's going to survive me. Because I think I knew at that point that my odds of being able to, I always say, believe this, I knew that I probably wouldn't have, offspring that would survive me, right? I wasn't sure, for a variety of reasons, none physical, but more having to do with me being me, I think. I was like, yep, probably not going to wind up having kids. I would really like, for someone to remember me in 100 years. And the best way to do that is to maybe do some good writing and some books and some stuff that people find interesting and that will survive me. And if you look on WorldCat, I have some stuff in bookshelves. So I suppose at least database systems will remember me after I'm gone. But really, I think it was the real thing was to have things that will survive me, work that will survive me, that people will say, oh yeah, look at this. Oh yeah, I guess this Ken Mondschein was an interesting guy back in the day. So yeah, I'm sorry to be a downer, but I am.
No, that's how I found out about you, was through your book. I got it for Christmas, and I read it. I liked it, and so I've now reached out to you, and we're chatting. And I would recommend it for other people too. On Time, it's a very general introduction to timekeeping in the Western world.
And a little bit of the Eastern, but not really.
Yeah, it does. It kind of does touch into Chinese timekeeping and Middle Eastern as well, but it focuses mainly on the Western world and from ancient times to present. You're talking about 20 years ago, 9/11 happened. That's quite a lot of time. Like kids that were just born in there, they're almost able to drink now. In the States and Canada, they can drink. So, what are some changes you've seen in the field of history that have taken place? Anything notable?
It's funny that you should say that, it's so American that we like measure how old somebody is by their being able to imbibe alcohol. In my experience, drinking age has never stopped anyone. And I live in Massachusetts, so it's actually not the drinking age; it's the able to buy pot legally age. So that's important.
I guess that is a big change now. People can legally buy pot, and 20 years ago, you get thrown in jail for it.
Yeah, God help, So yeah.
I'm not sure if that really relates to the field of history, though.
No, but it does relate a lot to. It does relate a lot to. I think our mentality as a society, and it's a big change. Also to my students' ability to stay awake. Had I had students right now in the classroom, or at least to tolerate me. Anyway, so in all seriousness, though. The biggest change I've seen is in history, especially in my own field of medieval studies, is the adoption of critical race theory and critical race theory as a lens. And I think that, and I'm not saying this in like a Republican, oh my God, they're teaching critical race theory, but the entire idea, like we're talking before about representation in history, that comes from critical race theory, or even asking questions about race. That's a big change because it used, a generation ago, people were like, women's history. We need to know about women's history. Why are women important, right? And then like Writing on Time, right? I have pitifully few women in that book because I couldn't really, I've struggled to write women in because so many of the people who got credit for the inventions and everything who are remembered by the historical record were men. And so, talking about, but certainly like in the industry, right? The radium girls, right? Female clockmakers, things like that, and it felt, but it's to such a point like that. It felt weird and awkward that has such a male history, right? That's something that's been kind of baked into us. And certainly a lot of the stuff I do, like the fencing stuff, the sword fighting texts, is in many ways very masculinist, which isn't to say that women are not, present. I have female fencers, a print of female fencers actually on the wall opposite me that you can't see. And I have a whole talk I do, and you can find the YouTube video of it on women in fencing, right? And women, in Swords Women.
Parent Trap. Movie Parent Trap. They got some female fencing in there.
Oh yeah, they do. Yeah. But more than just Parent Trap. It just, the oldest fencing book we have is from like about 1325 has a female fencer in it, right? So there's a long history of representation. So talking about that, even something that's seems so male and masculine, it's hard not to talk about women in it, right? It feels weird. And that in the same way, because that's like so been baked into me, right, over the course of my education, my career, to such a degree that it's just like one of those questions that instantly springs to mind about whatever, right? How does it relate to gender roles? How does it relate to women? That's just something that is just there. And then now we're starting to say, well, what about race and concepts of race? And that can be dangerous and different from gender roles, because of course, there have always been women, and there have always been men. And I would argue there have probably always been people who have been trans to one degree or another, because the image behind me is actually a trans fencer from the late 18th century. Up top, I've got an image of actually a trans fencer fencing a fencer of African descent. I can't really say African American because he's not African or American. Is Chevalier Saint George, who is Haitian and European descent, and he by asking questions of race, right? And even though race was differently construed in many ways in the past, and sometimes the questions people ask, I have to say, are not apropos or are anachronistic to the mentalities back in the day, right? Because race is not, one thing that critical race theory, if you read critical race theory, and I've taught at least, a cursory version of critical race theory, is that ideas of race are socially constructed. Not so long ago, the Irish were a different race. Now the Irish are white, right? Jews, right? We were there, we were like a great test case because we were the other, and we were raced in the Middle Ages, and we were, the most preeminent other. And today, of course, we're considered white. So but of course, people of African descent, right? That's one of our huge concerns in our modern society, right? The Black Lives Matter movement, right? Front and center, it's real, it's here, it's urgent. Hard to write that into the medieval past, when certainly there are images of Africa and Africans and knowledge of Africa and Africans, much more so, of course, in the Dar al-Islam and the lands bordering the Muslim world than in France, Holy Roman Empire, British Isles themselves. Certainly that, but it wasn't really as front and center or as urgent in their society as in our society, there's a big change, of course, once the Portuguese voyages exploration began, and the first cargo of enslaved Africans came to Lisbon in about 1420, I believe. And then things changed like greatly, and then you start seeing a lot more representation of Africans in art and in different ways. But it's hard to, like, if you're a Chaucer scholar or doing like medieval English literature, or you're doing like the Capetians or something like that, fields which are arguably important that need to be studied, to really argue that much of race into it. You can certainly find things, right? But it's going to be small and rare representations. In some cases, it's going to be a stretch. But we can find some things, and we can get some ideas of attitudes and ideas of towards Blackness, certainly. But should we center that in our study of the Middle Ages? It's hard, because it's hard to argue that that in a sense that we need to treat the distant past, as another country, right? And it's, in a sense, it's a form of imperialism to write our own concerns into their past, into their society. Does that make sense?
Yeah. What is it? Historicizing the past, kind of projecting backwards, taking our current problems and writing them into a place where they didn't really exist to try and make arguments for the present, is kind of what you're getting at.
And there's an irony to that, right? And there's a definite irony to that, because we rely on arguing that what we're doing is important to the now to receive our funding, right? To receive our tenure track jobs, to receive the whatever we want, right? If you're just interested in the arms and armor of the Byzantine Empire or something, no big deal, right? That's not something anyone's going to have a tenure track job in, and it's going to be like a bunch of hobbyists, and there's going to be someone out there, in the arms and armor community who's a historian is much, much looser. But you're not going to get a job in a university doing that stuff.
So all of this is kind of touching on some of the complications in the field of history. Just to quick summarize the last question that I asked, some of the bigger changes that you've noticed in the field are the lenses of perception that are being used to address historical topics. Correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and the inclusion of race is not just one topic, but perhaps I would say in many ways the most important topic. And it's related also to diversity, equity, and inclusion in the university, and the mandates for diversity, equity, and inclusion in the university, which is, a very important thing. I'm not going to put that down, right? That's something that's very, very important. But it's hard to argue it's really hard to argue the continuing importance of medieval history, right? Here's what I'm getting out of this, right? Is that it's hard to argue that medieval history is important, because in some cases you have to, really torture it to make it DE&I relevant. But on the other hand, if we don't, then we don't study medieval history, and then it gets picked up by the guys who are like, but Vikings were all white, and it gets put down by the community of professional historians, and then authority is granted to those other communities. So that's it. So my argument for it is simply like, okay, this is important, right? It need not be a main focus, but we must pick it up and carry it forwards and fund this, because if we drop that ball, it's going to get picked up by somebody else and carried off someplace we don't like. Okay?
Yeah, that makes sense. So what are the most challenging things in the field of history, according to you?
My drinking. Now, the most challenging things in the field of history are, it's definitely finding employment, being employed, making it relevant, right? That history is not a degree that I would recommend to anybody, that, or at least unless you're going to law school or something like that, right? It's fine as undergraduate, but I think no one should be a professional historian. I think we're sort of entering a dark age in some ways, right? That in some ways we're entering this I think that we're entering this time of decline of the profession of historical writing, and because it's no way to make a living.
I did see a tweet the other day from a history professor I follow, and he said that the textbook he's been using has been getting some complaints that the students can't understand it very well. And they said that they usually get their information from TikTok instead of textbooks. And so I think that would kind of be in the same vein of what you're talking about.
We've become a post-literate society, right? I mean, well, here's the thing, too, is that the divide between the divide between selective schools, I would say elite schools, like if you're teaching at Vanderbilt, you're teaching at Cornell, you're teaching at Northwestern, or Boston College, or Colgate, probably, then you can give a textbook and the kids are going to understand the textbook, they're going to be able to read it. But the supply of 18-year-olds going to who are college ready is contracting, and schools are lowering and lowering their admissions criteria in order to maintain enrollment, which, by lowering the selectivity, you start to get you get a lot of people who perhaps would not be going to college a generation ago. They might be going to trade and vocational schools, but also there's also a generational decline in long form literacy, and people who have the intention and the ability to read long form. We become a much more visually and video and audio oriented society. I'm trying to remedy this by doing actually a video world history textbook as a project. But the reason why I'm doing this project is that I also just did a master's in education and learning and media and technology to better communicate with these people. But I mean, if you look at society as a whole, we have both an unprecedented access to information and a desert of quality information, and be able to discern what it is. And what people believe is that which has the immediate emotional and visual appeal, right? Which is how TikTok works, right? And that's how...
Yeah, and that loops back to what you're talking about with the brain bugs and needing to know about our own biases, and to keep an eye out for that, to not get taken in by such a sensationalist presentation.
Well, the thing is, you can't do anything about it. And so we have this cognitive bias, right? So we've got this cognitive bias towards that in our society, right? Not talking about professional historians, but we have this cognitive bias towards the short form and the visual and the immediate, right? And we have one of two things. We can either exclude this group of people and just, you see them as something to be managed, which is a very classist way of looking at it, almost Dickensian. Or we can try to include them, but that means that we need to learn new ways to communicate. So no, your students can't read the textbook, right? That's not really so much in the field of history itself, but that's in the teaching of history and the communicating of history. And that change has not been made, because history professors, by definition, we are the people who are good at doing history, right? Who learn well by lecture, who can read the textbook and understand it and digest it and spit it back and write essays and do primary resources and research and learn languages and do this sort of stuff. The kid, the kids these days, they are, if they're not doing that, then one, I mean, schools are cutting history departments, right? Because kids don't want to major in history. It's too much reading, too much writing. That's not what they're good at. We're changing assessment, right? The assessment, the term paper is gone in a lot of places. And it does make a huge class divide between selective and not selective schools, right? It just increases that gap. But it also, it not only increases the gap, it also means that we do need, for social good, it means we do need to communicate history and history things in new ways. And unfortunately, ways that may not, if poorly done, contribute to critical thought, but there's lots of ways of doing that. There's no reason why we can't use video as evidence and primary sources and things, maybe not from the Middle Ages, but videos and things in new ways of teaching, right? And a more multimedia way of teaching history.
In summary, then, some of the challenges that you've taken note of are employability, getting a job in the field of history. It's a challenge to find that. The decline in education, the lowering of the bar for accepting new students, the way that people are being taught. And another challenge is trying to come up with new methods to accommodate for the growth in technology, the new types of medias that are out there with TikTok and Twitter. We didn't have all this 20 years ago.
The new way kids think, right? I don't want to judge this as like a lowering, right? Or that people are getting stupider. I think they're just differently intelligent.
So it's not that the education quality is dropped. It's that they're allowing students of different backgrounds into the classrooms, or
what's happened is inequality in American society has increased in that instead of being able to put their mental spoons towards learning, kids these days got their spoons going towards surviving. Kids are working jobs, kids are doing this and doing that. It's not like, oh my God, it's very classist to say, okay, well, these kids these days, they're stupid. It's like, no, these kids may not have the attention and the leisure for that. You can't make someone who's working, 2 jobs as well as going to school full time have to go full time to get your financial aid. Say, okay, read these 600 pages, right? That's ridiculous. Maybe you need to account for that and also account for like lived experience. So I think that the sort of modes of thought that upper middle class people, i.e. history professors, are more difficult and going to decline in certain segments of the population. But I think it's also because, frankly, the population is so stressed because of the growth of income inequality. So, and of course, my honest opinion regarding the historical profession, or at least a lot of people teaching in the historical profession, is that a lot of them have their heads up their asses so much that they don't recognize that. And it's imperative to be able to communicate with the population of people who are going to college today in an idiom in which will reach them and make this is incredibly important. When I designed for my textbook, this open access world civilization textbook, is that you should be able to read to do it on your phone, on a break in your shift at work. So short chunked videos with the sound off. So closed caption. So like that's what you have to do. Say to the kid, hey, here's this big like 20-pound textbook, carry it around and read 60 pages of it and write a paper on it by next week. You're setting them up for failure.
So really the two main challenges are finding employment and figuring out how to communicate to the next generation of people interested in history.
Let me even simplify that more. Okay. Finding employment. Why has there been such a contraction in the field? People don't think it's relevant. They don't want to fund it. Okay. The biggest change, the biggest problem has been the growing income inequality and the growing desperation of our society. And so we're simultaneously destroying our audience, even as we keep shouting at them in the same language that they just don't have the spoon. People just don't have the spoons, right? The problem is privilege in so many ways, because so many, to do something so stupid as to be a professional historian, you got to already have a bunch of privilege. So you have a bunch of middle class, upper middle class people yelling, if you don't live in an elite, lucky enough to live in an elite institution, right? You're not teaching at Reed or something, yelling in a foreign language at a bunch of people who don't understand that language, right? It's like the conquistadors yelling, reading their requiremento to the Native Americans. It's just an act of cultural imperialism. And you got to learn to speak that idiom. You got to learn to speak that language, right? You want to teach people, learn to speak their language first.
So we've been discussing the thick of it for a little while. Let's talk about some of the thinner aspects. What have you enjoyed? What are some of the positive sides of the field of history from your point of view?
Well, I'm essentially an existentialist, so it gives me something to do to give me meaning. If in this window I have of existence, right, between my not being, my like Lao Tzu, right? Am I just dreaming of a butterfly, or is a butterfly dreaming it's me? So yeah, here I am in this moment when these atoms have lined up in such a way as to produce the illusion of consciousness. So it gives these atoms something to do, right? And the illusion of meaning.
So your favorite part has been the illusion of meaning, being able to exercise the mind a bit, to take up the time while you're here.
What even is the mind, Yeah, this is really pessimistic. I'm sorry. I like, at its best, history is a detective story, and you're putting together pieces of puzzle and you're finding stuff out and you're like, oh, that's cool, right? And you get that in the zone, you get that sort of limerence,
the flow
right?
state, yeah.
You get the flow state, right? That's kind of why we're here.
So I want to talk about some controversy. What do you think is the most controversial topic in your specific field of history?
Oh, it's the critical race theory stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And people are like, oh, if you don't believe this, then you're a racist. Oh, well, you're illusion. It's just crazy. It's completely degenerate. Frankly, I'm staying out of it because it just got so unpleasant. And I only have so much energy and so many spoons, and I'm just looking at this mudslinging and this like tribalism going on, and I'm staying out of this. I'm not even gonna read any of this. I'll read whatever important works come out that people, a bunch of people say this is important. I'll read it, but the fact that so much of history is now taking place on social media, so much of the toxicity that implies, I'm staying out of that, right? I don't stress myself out over that. I'm trying to find a job, right? Saying these things on a podcast publicly may be the death of me anyway, but yeah. So that's this social media mudslinging makes us look ridiculous, and frankly, it's so unprofessional, and on both sides, right? It's everybody. It's I just want to just tell everyone to shut the hell up, because you're not helping us. You're right. You're not helping the profession. You're just making us look like morons. So, yeah.
Yep, I'm for the pursuit of wholesomeness and professionalism, so I don't condone the mudslinging, the insults, the nonsense that is out there either. I would hope that my followers are in the same type of boat. Anyone that's watching this, it's I think it's more beneficial to keep it respectful to a degree. I mean, people have different views on what respectful is, but as far as the ad hominems, the fallacies, that stuff is better left unsaid, in my opinion. So Critical race theory, that is incredibly controversial. I guess I could have guessed.
Yet also interesting and necessary, right?
Yeah, it is. So it needs to be discussed, but it is also controversial. So avoiding the nonsense and focusing on what really matters, that's, I think, the most important part there. You think, you mentioned, maybe crucifying yourself over making that statement. Would you be willing to share what your most controversial opinion is in your field?
I think I said them all. I don't think anyone has called me to task for any opinions that are really controversial. I mean, some of the HEMA people disagree with me, but I think it's, the historical martial arts people disagree with me. I think it's just on general principles. What is my most controversial opinion? I don't know. I think just my freaking nihilism. So, I think a lot of people shy away from nihilism, but I think those people are cowards, and they do need to face. Would it be different if I had tenure someplace? Had a more fiscal stability. Got to live my life the way I wanted to. No, I think I'd still be depressed. But I think that nihilism can be terribly freeing, and that historical nihilism, right, is a free, can be a freeing thing. And that, if you think about on time, is if I have an overriding historiographical principle, it is nihilism, right? That nothing is determined, that nothing is destined to be, that things are the way they are in some ways because of chance. Pace Lucretius der natura. And that in some ways that I use this in an anti-racist, anti-imperialist sense, but in other ways, also the Western way of doing things came about. And certainly it's good that we live in a world with penicillin and air travel. Well, maybe not air travel considering the pollution, but air travel, whatever. I mean, you think about it, modernity has given us vaccines, right? I'm glad for vaccines. I'm glad for...
Penicillin's good.
Yeah, penicillin's good. Vaccines are good. The Green Revolution was, definitely more on the good side of leisure sheet. Kept millions, maybe billions of people from starving to death. So there's that. But a lot of these things were definitely Western innovations. I think maybe if you want controversy, that's it. Is that I don't see the history of the West as all unalloyed bad, but I see everything as kind of a mixed blessing, right? Everything is complicated, and I don't like reducing things. So I'm willing to say yay, vaccines, penicillin, public health initiatives, the germ theory of disease, all these different things are good, and they're they're mostly unalloyed goods, right? Birth control has been incredibly freeing. Feminism, right? Incredibly important, incredibly freeing. Western mode of thought. So I guess the fact that I am not as down on the West as a whole, because the West kind of formed me, right? And I speak of this as somebody who, is at least in terms of his inheritance, an other. But my genetic inheritance, I'm an other. But certainly, I exist in a Western intellectual mode, which is ultimately derived from Christianity, right? And that looking at this and saying, well, this is where we came from, right? This is the world we're living in. And that if we tear it down and say it's all bad, then we have nothing. It's okay, Greta Thunberg, okay, all for the environment, but you can't live without petroleum products. It's impossible to truly be a moral vegan in the world, which isn't to say we shouldn't strive to be as just as we can possibly be, but we live in a world where the inherited sin is so great that we can't ever be free of that. I know I'm speaking in a Christian mode now, unintentionally, but life eats life. Life feeds off of life, and we can't ever be free of that. So we just need to look at the four noble truths, that there is suffering, that the way to avoid suffering is to or not avoid suffering. You can't avoid suffering, but it's we have to change our relationship to suffering, right? Is what we have to do.
So your most controversial stance is your historical nihilism. Is it, in your opinion?
Yeah, it's my historical nihilism. Well, maybe my general nihilism. I don't know. But no one's ever really called me out. It's something I really share a lot. Or like I put face forward to my work. It's
right.
just where my head's at.
When you were talking, I heard you mention something. Does historical nihilism and historical determinism, do those things stand at odds with each other?
No, I mean, historical nihilism isn't really a term. I just mean taking existential nihilism as a historiographical skill in school. But historical determinism, right, is positivism, right? That things happen couldn't really happen any other way. I would say they can almost be antonyms in some ways, because if we're going to truly look at a historical nihilism, right, like which was actually something that actually Soviet historians, I believe, applied to people who were not Marxist-Leninist, because of course they thought that those laws were the basis for society. Okay, so they thought that those were incontrovertible and true. Okay, so the people who didn't believe as they did were the nihilists. But I think that even though it's not really a coherent school of thought, that if we did maybe take the term and put it into a coherent school of thought, then it would be kind of antithetical to historical determinism, right? That instead it's simply, things happen, right? And things happen, right? They happen for reasons. We can determine the reasons why they happen, but we need to also realize they could have happened in other ways, perhaps, or not, or maybe they couldn't have happened in other ways. But also, we shouldn't judge, right? That you kind of have to see it with non-judging perspective. I don't know. So far, my favorite Marvel MCU thing is the What If cartoon. So maybe it's just me with my.
I think there's a series of books titled What If, written by historians, and they take a scenario. They say, what if this had happened? And then they determine what would have happened if that thing had happened. So,
but that's also the great man's school of history. Like just one, the one pebble can actually turn the tide of history, where there's so many more complicated things.
Yeah, and the butterfly flapping its wings in South America. We are just over an hour here. I wanted to talk about your books a little bit. I am familiar with On Time, but you have another book coming up, right?
Not anything imminently, really. I've been really busy getting my master's in education, working on a couple of things, conference proceedings, something on primary sources in medieval timekeeping, a deep dive into scholastic philosophy, which will be of interest to nobody except me. But I have a book on Game of Thrones and the medieval art of war. People may be interested in a bunch on fencing. I'd like to write a book of history of fencing. I'd like to write a bunch of things. I'd like to get my fantasy novel published. I'd like to do a lot of things. Finding the time to do it is the trick.
Yep. I mean, you out of all people would know about timekeeping and how to manage your time to try and find more of it. It seems like there's always less, at least from my perspective.
It accelerates.
So yeah, you've got quite a lot of books, a few articles out there. You said you're on YouTube on a few places. You have a website. What do you do with your website?
It's basically like my internet business card. I don't really blog or anything. I do write for medievalist.net. If I come up with an idea of something I feel like I need to say, I can send it over to medievalist.net. Kind of working on a piece, which I don't know when I'll finish it, but it's on medieval antinatalism and or child freeness. I don't know if child free is the right word for it, but kind of a combination of those two ideas, being against propagating human species and being against having children for oneself. So I thought it was an interesting topic. It's kind of sort of like inspired sort of by falling birth rates, sort of the pessimism of our times.
It sounds like it's a bit personal for you too, since you mentioned not having kids, you want to have books instead, which are kind of like kids. They take a while to raise and take a lot of time and effort. So
horses are good though. You can just put them out in the field.
Horses. We're at the tail end of the show here. I give everybody a chance on this series to leave a message for people who are new to historical studies, who want to pursue a hobby or a career in historical realms. What message would you give to these people who are just kind of interested in it but haven't invested a lot of time or energy yet?
Learn to weld. It's a good trade. Make a lot of money. I don't know. I have a lot of thoughts on that, actually. I'm supposed to have a few thoughts, some of which aren't even cynical. Big one is do it, right? Another thing is that you don't have to spend, ruin your life getting a PhD. That what you do as an amateur is valid, right? Particularly if you don't think people are going to support you in a doctoral program. Don't get a doctorate in history, I guess, would be my biggest thing, which people told me, but, I didn't listen. So good luck with that. Do it. I mean, if it's what gives you meaning and gives you purpose, then you should do it.
So yeah, pursue your dreams. If it gives you some sort of meaning or sense of purpose, then go for it. You heard it here. So, Ken, thanks for joining me today. I appreciate you taking time out of your schedule for this.
Thank you very much.
Be sure to drop any other questions you wish I had asked in the comments below. Before I go, I owe the Ctruth patrons a huge thanks for their continued support in my endeavor to explore and map the world of chronology, so thank you all. Before you go, like the video, subscribe to the channel, drop a comment, and check out some of these other videos.